and it has become quite clear to us that the challenge of India, as far as coal transition is concerned, will be how do we make the transition for the poorest of the poor, who are now dependent in these districts on coal economy. Because if you see today, the practice in Coal India Limited is when they close a coal mine, they shift the worker to some other mine, formal worker. But that's not the case with informal worker. We have started documenting case studies of underground mines where while there is some sort of arrangement made for the formal worker, there's nothing done for the informal worker as well as contractual worker. They are left high and dry in many of the case studies that we have done. Now, today's webinar is to bring a lot of different perspective on informal worker and informal economy, and to discuss a paper which my colleagues have done over the last 6 to 8 weeks by visiting few coal districts, understanding the kind of informality that exists. In fact, doing some classification of informal coal workers. There was survey done as well as focus group discussion took place with informal workers to understand both the type of informality, their income levels, as well as their aspirations. And I'm happy that Sresha is going to present that paper today. And with that, after that paper, we also have a very good panel to discuss that paper as well as other aspects of informal coal economy in India. Now, the panel actually is a very, very knowledgeable panel, I must say, because we have members from academia, we have a representative of trade union, from journalism, as well as from civil society. So you are going to hear a lot of perspective on informal economy and the transition of informal economy in India today. With this, let me now invite Timon, our partner in this whole study from Wuppertal Institute in Germany, to discuss his perspective on informal economy as well as the informal sector in Europe and his experience of that. So Timon, the first presentation is yours. The floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you, Chandra, for that opening remarks and for the webinar, which I find interesting. You said I should discuss informal workers in Europe. That could be very short. It's a non-issue in coal regions, and with that, I basically could almost stop. But I use the time to speak, I don't know, to do a little bit advertisement, like it's with YouTube, you always have the commercial before you can look at the good video. And we, as a team at Wuppertal Institute, we've been working for the last 5-6 years on coal regions, mainly in Germany and Europe. And we've put together a lot of information in coal regions because it's our view and our experience that it's especially the regional level, the policymakers, the regional administration, the regional decision makers that lack capacity and lack knowledge on how to manage the process. And so this is why we thought we put together a toolbox, a handbook, condensing the information which we found mainly looking at Europe, but also now more and more at global examples. And in this toolbox, we try to give really concise information, good practice examples, but a reference to a lot of existing information. And I'll share the chat. I'll share the link in the chat, and I'm happy if you look at it and read it, and I think it will be helpful. But for the issue we have today, basically, it's not helpful because we found informal workers is a non-issue, and it's not something where we can say much. So I have to listen. I want to take 2 minutes just to look at Germany and historic examples. And funny enough, I've heard similar things from Chandra and Shweta, who are very well of European developments. This is a picture of the Ruhr area in the 1960s, one of the big coal mining areas in Germany, one of the biggest in Europe, solely depending economically on coal. If you look at it, what it looks now, it looks pretty much like this. The transition away from coal has been completed. And if I look at the number of jobs, here you see the number of jobs over the last 200 years. We had a peak of 500,000 jobs in the late 1950s, and it went down to zero. Last coal mine was closed in that region. Nothing had to do with economic reasons. There would be a lot to tell, but I want to just highlight one thing. And what I find interesting is that in this process, the first university in that region was built in the 1960s, 1964. Before that, that region did not have a university, none at all. And I find this remarkable because it's a very urban, very densely populated region. And for me, that is a transition away from looking only at the coal miners, but looking at larger the region. Because obviously in a university, it's not like the coal miners are going to university and after they've been basically in the 1960s with shovels have been digging coal, they're going to study. It is obviously about the children of the miners, about the neighbors, the children of the neighbors, and the future of the region. I find this extraordinary that it took us so long to set up a university in that region. And if I compared, for example, the University of Madras was set up 100 years earlier than the university of the most urban, most densely populated region in Germany. So, and I think it symbolizes that, okay, that region really undergoes a transition away from coal to a very different modern society and economy. So if I basically zoom out a little bit, when we discuss about coal transitions in the global north, I often see that there are some people who very strongly focus on the miners, on direct jobs, and then more vague about indirect jobs, like not the people employed in the mines, but who have service contracts. And then in another sphere, in the region. And as I said, university for me is you focus on the region, right? It's the regional development. But honestly, we've not looked at informal workers. And I think those three levels from direct jobs, indirect jobs, and regional development are very important to keep in mind when looking at coal transitions. But looking at informal workers puts in a totally different level, totally different layer of complexity. And I have nothing to say on it because I don't know anything about it. So I shut up and I'm very happy to listen and hear and learn. And back to you, Chandra or Shrestha.
Thank you, Timon. That graph, one of the most striking fact in that graph is from the time the coal economy started going down in Ruhr till the time the employment was zero, the direct employment reached zero, it was about 60 years. So it took 6 decades for Ruhr to transition. I'm wondering if we have that kind of time in our part of the world. Nevertheless, it's again an issue that we all can think about. But let me now request Shrestha for her presentation on informal coal worker and informal coal economy.
Thank you, sir. So good afternoon, everyone, and very welcome for joining this session today. I feel which is a very niche topic in some way, but which is the most important topic in many sense when we are talking of a energy transition and a just transition in the context of India, and not just India, but many countries of the global south with similar economies. Now, as Chandrabhushan said in the beginning, that this is a question that as we at iForest are working at the subnational level, particularly in the coal states like Jharkhand, Chhattisgarh, and now in Odisha, we constantly encounter is this issue of informal workers. And it is one of the most evident kind of workers you will see if you are traveling to the coal regions. But at the same time, it is very poorly understood and estimated. There is confusion between who is indirect, who is informal, and all of that sorts. Now, earlier last year, we undertook a study actually to understand what just transition will mean for India. And one of the most stark findings, we did a pan-India evaluation looking at broad numbers, big pictures. We tried to look at the impact on workers among various other things. And one of the most telling pictures that came out is the informal workers in the coal mining sector are particularly vulnerable. This is due to a number of reasons. One is the number of workers that is involved, but secondly, also that coal mining is one sector which is going to face transition challenges in the coming decades. Now, that is beside the point of discussion today. So from that point, we started thinking of how do we go about looking at this informal sector. And this study was an opportunity for us to look into some of the key questions. I would like to say we do not have answers for everything, and that's why the very knowledgeable panel is there today. But I think this is a very important discussions we are having. So we came up with certain questions when we started this study. Number one is we wanted to provide an understanding of the role of informal workers in coal regions of India. What are the various roles that they have? We also wanted to understand that how is informal worker quantified? Do we have any data? Or if we don't, why don't we have that? The third question that was that trying to understand the terms of engagement, wages, as well as associated skill levels and education that are determined for this. The fourth question was that to understand also their opinion on coal transition, because these are like what we call in very generic language have-nots. So do they support a transition? Do they don't support a transition? Are they indifferent? What is it? And finally, at the end of all of it, we are trying to identify some of the key aspects that are important with respect to the informal workers that also must be taken into account to ensure a just transition. Now, this was broadly the approach we followed. As we said, that this particular study was about a 6 to 8 week period study, but it builds on our previous work. So we undertook a literature review of various, like looking into government's reports, data sets, scholarly publications, information of labor unions. We did number of expert interviews, and some of them are with us today. As well as we undertook district level studies by the way of conducting focus group discussions in 5 coal districts in 3 states, Jharkhand, Chhattisgarh, and Orissa, and we covered about 92 workers. All of them are informal. And also we took the observations from our previous studies, which were much more in-depth in Korba and Ramgarh, which essentially was actually based on extensive household surveys as well as community consultations. Now, this is a broadly profile of the districts we did focus group discussions and interviews in. I'm not going to get into the detail, but what essentially it shows is we took 2 districts of Jharkhand, 2 districts of Chhattisgarh, and 1 district of Orissa. The first 2 are Jharkhand, the second 2 are Chhattisgarh, and the last one is of Orissa. The reason we took this diversity of districts because they have varied coal history and they have different types of demographic distribution as well as the political economy context is different. For example, Hazaribagh is one of the oldest coal districts of Eastern India, and here currently 50% of the mines are loss making. It has also poor development indicators. At the same time, contrastingly, Bokaro is a much better district. It has diverse economic opportunity and it is more industrialized. Then coming to Raigad and Korea, these districts are dominated by scheduled tribe population with poor development indicators, and in districts like Korea, actually there are a large number of unprofitable underground mines. Currently, 90% of them are underground. And then we moved on to Orissa Angul district, where it is the largest coal producer of the state. It is a big industrial district as well. It has good development indicators as compared to many other coal regions of India. But at the same time, there are stark differences between the rural areas and the urban agglomerations. So we thought that it will help us to capture the diversity of the informal workers. Now, coming to to some of the key observations. First of all, and someone already posted this question in the chat box, that how do you define informal poll workers? Is there a definition there that we have? And when we started looking at this, there was no clear definition that defines poll workers. But what was available there was definitions put forth by government, and particularly two reports are extremely important. One is of the National Commission of Enterprises in the Unorganized Sector, which was published in 2007. And the second one is by the Labor Bureau, which looked into the conditions of informal workers. Essentially, what these two reports said, that the informal worker exists both in the formal sector as well as the informal sector. And what defines informality is the terms of their engagement. So like whether they have a contract or not, who is providing their social security benefits, do the employers provide, do they have a paid leave, do women get the proper benefits? So these kinds of terms and conditions determine, but it does not mean that informal sector only has informal workers and formal sector do not. They exist both ways. And if we put the informal workers in the informal sector and informal workers in the formal sector, they together constitute the informal economy. And I think for coal regions, the most important word is to actually use the word informal economy. Then, picking up from this observation, we tried to define informal economy and provide a classification of informal workers in coal regions. This is based on our own observations working in these districts, as well as scholarly observations, and Kuntala is here. In fact, I have largely picked up on her observations from Jharkhand studies as well. Now, the way largely we can categorize this is there is informal worker in the formal sector of coal, which relates to coal mining, coal washery, as well as coal transportation. And then there are informal workers who are part of the informal sector, who we can call own account workers, who are largely the coal gatherers and sellers, and then something called the coal mining in village commons. So these, in some ways, and simply put, these are small scale miners. So these are broadly the categories that exist if we want to classify. In these classifications, now there are various kind of work the informal workers are doing. For example, in coal mining and coal washery, they are doing technical and maintenance work. They're engaged in loading and unloading, cleaning, miscellaneous labor work, where they're working in multiple activities in multiple mines at the same time. In coal transport sector, as per the FGDs, we only captured two types, drivers and helpers. But then in our interviews with Truck Owners Association and our previous studies, as we recorded in Korba, there are also cleaners and mechanics who constitute part of the informal workers. And of course, then there are the coal gatherers and sellers. Now, this set of people are not very homogeneous, and they have varied skill levels, they have varied wages, their proportion varies in different parts. So the next question that we looked at is, what is the wage distribution given their skills? Now, the big picture of wage distribution comes out is largely right now, because coal mining is being more and more contracted out, many of the coal mining work, there is a large number of informal workers that is growing in these regions. And they are employed by contractors, subcontractors, and then there is a lot of engagement of middlemen. These people are involved in all this kind of work, and what is difference is that if they're semi-skilled workers, such as they are doing maintenance work, maintaining pipelines, etc., or drivers, their daily wages, if we calculate, is about 700 to 750 rupees. These people get the monthly payment. But then there is a huge set of people who are unskilled, doing various kind of work, as we have noted down, who is getting a daily wage ranging between rupees 250 to rupees 300, which is very, very low. And if I put it in like a monthly wage, because these people are working for 16 to 18 days, sometimes 20 days, it comes between somewhere Indian rupees 5,500 to 6,500, about $83 US. The reason it is, these wages are extremely compromised given the poverty, the poor levels of education, lack of bargaining power of this a lot of time. Now, when we just say that it is low wage, what does it mean? So we wanted to understand, taking certain benchmark, what does it mean? And we looked at two data sets. One is the JBCCI, what we call the Joint Bipartite Committee for the Coal Industry, that determines the wages for the workers who are employed by the contractors, as well as the national minimum wage. Now, if we look at these two data very clearly, we see that what is determined by the JBCCI, and by the way of it, I would like to say that the JBCCI is a body which consists of Coal India Limited, all its subsidiaries, the Singareni Colliery Limited, and also the central labor unions. Now, these representatives negotiate these wages. And if we see that, we are finding that the unskilled workers are getting only about 40% of what is specified by the JBCCI. Then we looked at the national minimum wage rates. Now, national minimum wage does not provide any minimum wage for coal mining. It is for all other mining. But there are certain kinds of works that these informal workers are engaged in, for which there is a national minimum wage. And it is per region. So if we look into the minimum wages for loaders and unloaders and people involved in cleaning work for states like Chhattisgarh, Orissa, and Jharkhand, the daily rate is about rupees 553 per month. Now, which is about $7 US. Now, even by this standard, if we look at, the cleaners are receiving only about 50% what they are supposed to receive, and the loaders and unloaders are 75%. Now, when we talked to these various people in these regions, but clearly the biggest apprehension was that the contractors take a cut, the subcontractors take a cut, or there are middlemen which just gives them because there is a supply-demand mismatch in these regions. We also tried to look into the gender aspect, particularly during the focus group discussions. We encouraged women participation. We were very careful about it. And what broadly comes out from ground observations as well as these discussions is women are generally involved in three kinds of work. There can be beyond this, but largely they are doing cleaning work. It can be a coal washery, it can be outside coal mines. And in fact, earlier in Korba, we captured that they are doing a lot of cleaning work in the power plants. They are doing miscellaneous labor work such as carrying coal on their head. And this is a very, very common sight. And then there is third, the coal gathering, which is not coal selling. So basically coal gathering, the women, they have no earning because they're just contributing to the family income. These other two categories of women are generally earning between rupees 250 to rupees 300 per month, which is about, I would say, $5 US. Sorry, per day. Now, so this is the big picture of what kind of informal engagement is there. Then we wanted to look at what is the quantification, and this is the biggest data gap that exists. In fact, there is no government data on informal workers at the district level due to limitations of the sample size. And today, Professor Malhotra is there, Kuntala is there, they have all worked on it, and we have talked to many experts, in fact, trying to look into this. And actually, there is nothing that exists at the district level because of the limitation of the sample size. What is there? In fact, we also checked with the Ministry of Statistics and Program Implementation. Now, what exists there are researchers who have done ground level surveys. iForest has been trying to do, and Kuntala has done earlier in eastern coal regions. These surveys give us some understanding of to quantify it. For example, when we did the Rampur study in 2000, we found that the informal economy is nearly thrice of the formal workers. In Korba, if we just looked into coal mining, the informal workers and formal workers were similar proportion, but what tilted the balance was the engagement of informal workers in the transportation sector. In fact, in Korba, there were over 50,000 people who were engaged in a transportation job and only 18,000 people who were engaged in formal coal mining jobs. And 90% of the transportation workers were informal. So this is the difference that exists also between districts when we try to quantify numbers. So what we concluded from this is one of the key things that will be important going ahead is generating government data on informal workers that is reliable and acceptable by various stakeholders. Because one of the responses we constantly got was that the sample is so thinned out in this national sample surveys that the data does not remain reliable. So this is something that will be important for the government to consider. And I personally believe that in absence of a standard method for quantifying informal workers, of course, studies are important, but that can raise questions of subjectivity. So we really need government data. But what is important is at the subnational level, studies by independent institutions are equally important to complement government data, to provide quantitative understanding as well as provide qualitative insights, because I think that's the merit of the detailed studies that some of us has been undertaking right now. Then we finally wanted to also, what we captured was the workers' opinion on coal transitions and alternative aspirations, because these are the people who are at the lowest rung, who are not getting anything which they're very clear of. Many of them told that we do not even like what we are doing. But the moment we went to ask them, and this is not the first time, they say that they do not want coal closure. It is just because that they do not have any alternative opportunities, or this is all they want, they know they can do. However, there are few people who actually thought that it is okay, or they remained indifferent about the closure, because they thought, and these observations were particularly coming from the tribal districts of Chhattisgarh or in Hazaribagh, Jharkhand, that they have the reason that today they're alienated because they have lost land, they have lost their agricultural productivity, their water got polluted, and therefore, if they get an alternative economy which is cleaner, better, which provides them dignity, they were well ready to embrace it. Now, in terms of aspirations for alternative livelihood, the biggest problem was that they cannot think what else they can do given their limited educational and skill levels. And this is very, very pervasive. For about 3/4 of the people, in fact, therefore, I just even quoted it, that they just said that we can do any other work which is there. And in fact, they were talking about bricklanes, they were talking about, a lot of people thought that they will migrate, but not very clear about where they can go. But what is clearly was coming out, that the youth are aspiring for something which gives them better wages and some amount of assurance. For example, people, when some of them specified alternative work, and the three most common ones that came out between the age group from 25 to 35, if I look into, was starting their own business with some government support. They do some technical work because they see that the technical workers get better paid, so they wanted support for those trainings, and then driving. These three are quite stark, besides other small things people try to point out. So finally, if we look into the overall consideration for just transition with respect to informal workers, there are many, many gray areas. We have now classified it, but now we need numbers against it very clearly, because lack of district level data on workers is a major impediment. If we do not have the data, it will become a major challenge to design the right kind of policy instruments, and more importantly, undertake targeted planning and implementation measures, and also estimate the financial support that will be necessary for this transition. And it will vary. So this is something we really need. And this is important for the state level policy decisions and planning, as well as national level decision making. We also need on-ground studies and assessment at the subnational level, because we want to capture some of the diversities which just numbers can't capture all the time. We need to map the skills, we need to map their education, wages, and understand, most importantly, the needs and aspirations. Because in many countries, just transition measures have failed because the needs, aspirations, people's mobility were not well understood. The fourth thing that is important is, and whenever we are going, that there is a need for sustained engagement for well-structured communication, because even a one-time survey may not yield the best of the responses. It is, we are talking about an economic shift and some closure of something which is their bread and butter. So there is apprehension, there is care about all of this. So people are not very comfortable discussing this. So we want a well-structured communication and sustained engagement to build the trust and build the consensus if this has to happen. And honestly, if this does not happen, it will create huge social disruptions. And finally, we feel that there is a need to organize the informal workers. And today Ashim is there, because this is clearly, many times this question is coming to us that, okay, coal industry has a lot of informal unorganized workers. How do you build a new energy? Will the renewable energy tomorrow we are talking of have the same problems of informality where people are not organized? And it will lead to the same chaos. So these are some of the outstanding questions I'll stop with, and I'll request CB to moderate the panel. Thank you.
Thank you, Sresha. Thank you for this very, very comprehensive presentation on our understanding. I think the one area where a lot of work will be required is one, to get a right methodology and then use it to estimate numbers. Because the two district study that we did, both Ramgarh and Korba, more than 70% of the workforce was informal. Now, there is certain confusion that is emerging as far as the term social security is concerned, especially with respect to insurance. Now, in India, there is universal health insurance is becoming a norm. And many of the employers are not now relying on government insurance rather than their own health insurance to even formal worker. So, and that insurance is also available to the informal worker. So, in our interaction in 5 districts, while many workers didn't know that they are covered under insurance, but many did had insurance cards, government health insurance cards, which is available to them. So, terms of engagement, how, as Shrestha started by saying, whether you are, do you get wages, do you get insurance, do you get leave, do you get benefits? There are multiple indicators that will be used to define whether you are an informal worker or you are a formal worker or you are somewhere in between. For example, there will be a lot of confusion whether contractual workers are informal worker or formal worker. The fact is some contractual worker will be informal and some could classify as formal. So this confusion around definition will be important to clarify. The second issue was that at the subnational level, I think workers are not, they cannot visualize what is the alternative available. And we have used different techniques over the last 2 years to get their perspective on what is it that they want to do, what is their perception on coal transition. And the answer that we get more or less all the time is that they cannot visualize a future, something that they can't see. The current, what they can see today is a coal mine, a coal washery and a coal truck. They cannot see something else. And therefore, their answers are not very clear because they cannot visualize what lies ahead for them in the future. And therefore, the continuous engagement and communication, these factors are going to be very, very important. So thank you, Sresha, for your presentation. And let me now, we will now move to the panel discussion. And as I said, we have very, very knowledgeable people on this panel to give their perspective on this issue. We have Professor Santosh Mehrotra, who is professor and chairperson of Center for Informal Sector and Labor Studies at JNU, Jawaharlal Nehru University. He has worked at UNICEF, UNDP. He was chief economist of UNDP for Global Development, Human Development Report of 2002 and 2005. Very knowledgeable on this topic. Kuntla, of course, I met Kuntla in early 2000 when she was counting number of cycle walas in Jharkhand, and basically brought out the informal economy part of coal economy almost 2 decades back. So happy to see you, Kuntla. And of course, we have Mr. Ashim Roy, who is founding general secretary of the New Trade Union Initiative, an independent trade union. Nidhi, my ex-colleague, who writes a lot on these issues in Gaon Connection, has traveled extensively to understand the informal coal economy. And then last and not the least, Ramesh Sharma, who stays there. And Ramesh has been there in Chhattisgarh, Jharkhand, Orissa, and he has been part of land movement worked with these informal workers who are also landless. So Ramesh has worked very closely with informal worker community in coal regions of India. Now, with this, let me now request Professor Santosh Mehrotra for his remarks, 5 to 7 minutes for each panelist, and then we will open for Q&A. To all the participants, please put your question in Q&A box, not in chat box. It will be impossible for me to read the chat box. So I'll take up your questions if they are in Q&A section. Thank you. So Professor Santosh Mehrotra.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chandrabhushan. I will try desperately to try and finish in 5 to 7 minutes, but so many issues have been raised. And firstly, I think I'm going to speak from a perspective which enables our German friends. I see a lot of attendees who are from Germany, and they may simply be completely lost by this informality discussion. Firstly, 91% of India's workforce is informal. If you include agriculture, 85% of India's workforce is informal if you leave out agriculture. So what stands out about coal is that the ratio between formal and informal that Shrestha was talking about is actually well exceeded in the general workforce. Let me turn to this definitional issue. Let's sort this one out. Otherwise, you'll be floundering in this for a very long period of time. Firstly, ILO had sorted this one out. The International Conference of Labor Statisticians had sorted this one out between 1993 and 2003 for us. And honestly, Shrestha, that's the definition that you need to go with. That's the definition that's globally recognized. And there's no need to go. I'll refer to some of the definitional issues that were brought up in the chat box, as well as what Mr. Bhushan said. Let me just say, 1993, the ICLS said, tried to define informal enterprises. But the definition of informal workers came only in the ICLS of 2003. So I think you need to look at that definition. And essentially, that's what I'm using in order to say what I'm about to say now. You see, you mentioned a series of features of informality. There's a spectrum of informality, but push comes to shove in the last analysis when you need to take, decide about who's informal, who's not, who's formal, then you have to see whether the worker has access to social insurance or not. What is social insurance? 1, old age pension. 2, death and disability insurance, i.e. accident insurance. And 3, maternity benefit from the point of view of the woman. There are many other considerations, hours of work, leave available, etc., etc. It does not have to do with someone being paid a salary or being paid a wage, because as Shrestha rightly pointed out, there are informal workers who are without social insurance in the so-called formal formal sector as well. What do I mean by that? That these are, the collieries, the companies have informal workers, and contractual workers usually do not have social insurance. So there is almost without fail, all contractual workers will be informal. That means they will be with, they'll be, because they will not have any social insurance, they'll be informal. One other thing about data. Now, you are not going to get the data from the NSS. However, one thing that occurred to me while you were speaking, Shrestha, is the following, that there is a state level sample, and many states actually carry out a more detailed survey using that same, sample design. But you could pay them more. You could get them to do in the districts where coal is being mined a very specific survey, which actually gives you a quantitative estimate based on this on a bigger sample for those particular districts. Let me turn to a third issue of the transition for informal workers. I believe, as you rightly said, Shrestha, they don't want to do anything else, obviously. They see no alternative in the area where they live, rural, very uneven terrain, the only form of a work available being, coal mining with their hands for many of them. They can't even visualize what else to do. However, if the government had a strategy, it would have to be a, twofold strategy. Firstly, a strategy which would pull these adult workers, both men and women, into construction work in local towns. That means public investment has to be initiated by the townships, by the state government in nearby towns for, to build infrastructure. If infrastructure was to improve in the nearby towns, there's a possibility that private investment will be attracted and some industry might come up. And therefore, these workers first transition out of coal into construction work because they are poorly educated, poorly skilled, they don't know what else to do. And then from construction workers, they could perhaps move into factories. This is the long-term strategy. But it needs to start now because for the obvious reasons. The second element in the strategy is obviously the children of these informal coal miners get a quality education. That's the only way they are going to exit out of coal. Otherwise, they will intergenerationally keep moving from, being coal diggers to being coal diggers. But that, obviously, the success of that strategy, once they were getting education, would depend upon whether non-farm jobs in the area or in the vicinity was growing or not. So it's not just about continuous engagement and raising awareness. It is about building infrastructure, about ensuring that these children are getting education. Let me move to another point why the European transition out of coal is not really relevant here. For the following reason, I think our German friends need to understand this. Firstly, I think in the growth process in Europe, the population growth rate had fallen very sharply well before this transition out of coal even began. Let's just remember that the investment in education and in Prussia began in the 1850s. You've got already a 100-year history prior to the transition out of coal that was already in place for the Prussian workforce, for the German workforce. At the same time, because of the population growth rate having fallen, there was a mortality transition and there was a demographic transition. So fewer people were joining the labor force. That's why you have such low levels of informality. It's not that informality doesn't exist. So, that we don't have that. We are talking about states in India which have coal concentrations in states which are among the poorest of India. And the poorest states of India have relatively higher population growth rates, have higher informality. And while it's true, Mr. Chandrabhushan, that for the poor in our country, the poor informal workers, the government is attempting to extend health insurance, but that health insurance is only for hospitalization, point one. Point two, no more than 100 million of our people actually have access to Ayushman Bharat. So it's not, of course, they're not aware, but even if you got awareness, this is a very partial health insurance. It is not old age pension, death and disability insurance, maternity benefit, which is what are the three core characteristics of formality for any workforce anywhere in the world, not just in India. And let me quickly close for the benefit of our European friends. They need to understand one thing. You see, I just said this, but I think this needs to be emphasized clearly. Coal mining in our country is concentrated in the poorest states of India, which are mainly agrarian states. They're not industrial states. They already have very low levels of industry in existence. very low levels of industrial employment. That's why the strategy of transition out of agriculture for these informal workers, as well as formal workers in the coal industry, depends upon alternative employment becoming available. But the trouble is that in India, 40% of our workforce is still agrarian. And this is after a period of 15 years from 2004 to 2019, when the absolute number of workers in agriculture began to decline for the first time. Until from 1947, when we became independent, to 2004, the absolute number of workers in agriculture was increasing, which is a very important reason why informality in our country is as high as it is. Unfortunately, COVID has induced the following. Reverse migration has taken place of about 30 million workers back to the northern poor Hindi belt states of India, which has increased the number of workers in agriculture from 200 million in the year 2019 to 232 million in 2020 alone. This has to be fixed. If we don't pull workers out of agriculture, we can't pull workers out of coal either. We have to create non-farm employment. The second thing I want to flag, which unfortunately Shrestha did not flag, is that this coal belt is also a very heavily tribal belt. The tribal belt in our country, in the eastern arc of our country, is also an area which has left-wing extremism, a left-wing extremism that has gone on for 50 years. And if we don't discuss that in the context of your coal transition, I think we are missing the boat. And I'll close. I'm sorry I've gone on for longer than I had intended, but I think for the benefit of our German colleagues, they need to understand what kind of stage we are at if we are going to address the informal workers in coal and in the entire economy. There are three groups of workers which are desperately in search of jobs in our country. One, there are the 40 million who are currently unemployed. Second, currently openly unemployed. I'm not talking about the underemployed. Second, 5 million young people are joining the labor force every year who need and are getting better educated and who need non-farm work. And third, there are those who are in agriculture, and there is surplus workers in agriculture, because in our country, agriculture contributes 14% to GDP, but there are 40% of our workers in agriculture. They have to be pulled out. That means there are three groups of people for whom non-farm work is to be provided, including for these coal informal workers. Let me stop there.
Thank you, Professor Mehrotra. Yeah, thank you, Professor Mehrotra. Ramesh Sharma, who is right now, I think he's abroad, and so I'll request Ramesh Sharma for his quick remarks before I ask other panelists to come in, because I think he has to leave. So Ramesh bhai, your 5 to 7 minutes, please.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Chandrabhushan bhai. Thank you, Shrestha Ben, and thanks to panelists also. It was a really very excellent presentation. So let me bring some ideas about what we are witnessing, especially in the state called Chhattisgarh, Odisha, and Jharkhand. Before talking about the workers, I would prefer to talk about the owners of those people who had a land, who had a forest, who had a rivers before, and because of the mining operation, they lost everything. So I would prefer to call them owners rather than workers. Let me bring some ideas about the larger framework of injustices, which we can see, especially in the coal mine area. The first and foremost important, there is a shrinking space for resources as well as the opportunities for the local people. And this is visible across coal mines area. When I say the loss of resources, the shrinking space for the resources, they have lost their land, they have lost their forest, and now in most of the area, they are also losing the water resources, the water bodies, the rivers and the small ponds, etc. At the same time, they don't have bigger opportunities if they lost their livelihood the land, forest, and water-based livelihood, there is no job available for those people who are largely like a tribal people, who largely remain completely unaddressed after the coal mines. The second very important point, in my opinion, is it's a denial of the people-centered governance framework. See, in this particular area, which is largely dominated by the tribal communities, there is a specific framework of PESA, Panchayat Extension Act in the schedule area. It's a fifth schedule area, very special constitutional power to the community to own their resources for their autonomy. There is a very specific provisions for the Forest Rights Act, but at the same time, there is a very interesting provision of DMF based on the new Mines and Minerals Development Regulation Act. But if you see the total framework of the implementation of all these available legal spaces, which is largely remain absent. So that's why the people who are dependent on the land, forest, and water before the mining operation or after mining operation, they are completely there is a huge denial of any justice to those people. The third very important point is a disregard for the common concerns. We have a really bad history, real bad history for the rehabilitation and resettlement of those people who lost their land, forest, and water. I'll take a few names if you want. The displaced, I call these all displaced communities a nowhere people, because once they lost the land, once they lost the forest, they lost forever. Take example of Kartala, Nunbara, and Surakachar, which was mined in the 60s and in the 70s. Take a recent example of Rani Atari and Chotia, which was mined 20 years back. Take a recent example of Kendai and Bhujan Kachar, which was mined just 5 years back. In none of these places, you can see any sorts of a rehabilitation or resettlement for those people who are largely dependent on the land and forest. So this is a huge issue. The second is that they are the people who are largely dependent on the common property resources for the livelihood. But as I said, that you can see, Shrestha, how the forest cover is decreasing in Korba, in Raigad, in some of those areas where people are largely the forest dependent. There are not just the tribal, but the forest dwellers also. So the complete absence of any protective measures for the common property resources is a huge challenge for those people who are unaddressed. The one issue which actually definitely want to flag here is the whole rhetoric of the reinvestment. Take a two example. The one is all about the CSR money. The big mining corporations, they earn a huge profits. But if you see, there is no social audit for their CSR fund, which is actually misuse and abuse on the ground. And most of these mining operations, mining companies, they have their own captive foundations and the societies and the committees where they pool the money on the one side and they drag the money from the other side. So there is no direct benefit actually reached out to those people who are like losing their everything. Two more important points I would like to flag here. If you see the whole the framework of the workers' right, as other speakers have also mentioned, that most of the workers who are engaged in the mining operation, they are the contractual workers. And we have a specific studies of some of those mining area. Take example of Vijaypur West. I have been recently there in the Vijaypur West, which is in the Korba district in Kadgora block. 80%, believe me, 80% are the contractual workers. And out of these 80%, the majority of them from the neighboring states. They are not from the local community. They are not the tribal people, because only the tribal people, they get maximum job like a guard or etc. There is, as I said, that the job is only available for the outsiders. A few years back, we have a similar studies in the Raigad district. In the Raigad district of Chhattisgarh, we find the same situation. Unfortunately, there is a very little space for the local community or for the local workers to raise their voice through the trade unions. The dying trade unions is the biggest threat for the workers' rights, especially in the mining area. And this become a really huge challenge. The last point, which actually I would like to flag here, It's all about the state responses, how the state is actually responding to the people's issues. Uh, as I said, that there is a massive acquisition is happening. Still, there is a massive acquisition is happening. And CB, you may shock that very recently the Chhattisgarh government has a two very specific MOU. One MOU with the mining department of Rajasthan for the mining operations in Sarguja. There is another MOU which is with the Maharashtra government, again mining in the Raigad district. So now it become a completely a political business. It's not like the issue which was earlier dealt with the corporations or the big mining companies, but now it's in between the state and the state apparatus. But if you see the reinvestment, I mean, why these districts become so poor? Because there is no reinvestment. Unfortunately, even after the DMF, even after the Mines and Minerals Development Regulation Act and the foundations, there is no significant amount has been actually spent for the people's welfare. And the last and my final point, and CB, you remember that this point, which I'm keep talking since last 20 years, there is a total absence of any grievances redressal mechanism on the ground. And this is the one of the most serious concern as far as the workers is concerned and as far as the land losers are concerned. Thanks, CB, and thanks to all of you.
Thank you, Rameshji, for bringing out some of the ground realities that is happening in the coal region. Let me now request Kuntala for her remarks. Kuntala. Yeah, please, Kuntala, please continue.
Oh, suddenly I couldn't hear you. Thank you, Chandra. Thank you for inviting me, and Shrestha. That was a great presentation and fantastic work as usual. And Timon, I have been to Ruhr University of Bochum, and I have been there twice actually to give talks in summer schools to PhD students, and I have also participated actually the Essen Ruhr Museum in Essen, when they put up the coal global exhibition, they took my advice to on informal coal workers. So great that memory has come back now. So I'll start with a guy called an imaginary name, Raghu. And Raghu used to work in a coal mine that had an accident. And Raghu was technically dead, but he was actually not dead because he was not working at that time when the accident happened. So imagine person X was working instead of Raghu underground, and that person X died. So this is an example of a system of informal labor replacement that goes on in India. It's called Bodli. Oshim Roy would know that very well. Bodli system is very rampant in formal sector. So what I'm trying to say here is, by this example, is that informal labor exists within the formal coal value chain. What Shrestha has pointed out, from throughout the entire value chain, from mining to washeries to transportation, and that entire value chain is informal, formal, coexist. So there are 2 points, lessons to be taken from this example. Point number 1, informal is not equal to illegal. So there are 2 different things. Informal can be licensed. For example, many quarries operate in India with perfect, licensed operations, but their labor structures are quite informal. As Oshim Roy would know, entire marble mining in India is informal, although they are all licensed and so on. And so there's a big complexity, and I have been working on this area with Oshimda also, so he would know that. Another thing is that the first imagination that comes to people in Europe, Europe or America or rich affluent nations is that there is a dual system. Informal and formal are two different systems. So the point that second point that we get is that there is no duality. They coexist. In India, they overlap and intricately enmeshed. The second story I'll tell you is about Nirjal Birhor. Nirjal Birhor lives in near Hazaribagh. He is a Birhor from Birhor tribe. And, this tribe used to be nomadic. He lost land. And now he works for contractors as a daily wage laborer, earning about $150, $200 per day. And there are, just like Raghu, Nirjal Birhor represents many others like him. So what I'm trying to say here is informalization is a political economic process, right? And that political economic process, informality, arises because labor becomes casualized and turned precarious by dispossession. Nirja, this is what Ramesh just said, that informal labor is created, cheap labor is created by ousting people out of their land. So a precarious work then becomes an economic compulsion. So precarious labor is created by dispossession. The second learning that we get out of this, first is informalization is a political economic process. Second is that informalization, it is also a gendered process. Women's work in production and social reproduction in coal regions. When we talk about informal labor, women are working to build up the communities, right? They are working to build up the communities. They are not only when they are physically working, that's not just the work that they are doing. They are also in social reproduction. So that work has to be counted as well. And that is totally uncounted in most cases. So social reproduction, if you include social reproduction, then informalization is a gendered process. So when you think of it as a gendered process, then it becomes easier to understand how culture plays a very important role in informal sector. So for example, how work is done, for example, how work is paid for. We have been in the chat group, we have been talking about how work is paid for, but how work is done. How many people get hourly wage rate? We celebrate May Day in a big way because May Day is 7 hours work day. But in India, we still pay your construction worker in your garden or your gardener by amount of work that is done. That's called piece rate work. So in India, piece rate work characterizes informality, not necessarily wage and salary. And then there are other things like child labor, bondage, caste hierarchies. We see all that, bonded labor, dead bondage, child labor, we see everything, of course, within informal sector. So I'll go to my third story. Third story is about Dulu Bagdi. Bagdi is a woman who's digging for coal in her own land in Raniganj. She is a semi-tribal, lower caste person, and as Ramesh said, she's digging her own land, but within this wider framework of injustices that surround coal mining in India. And similar to Dulu, there are people who are digging in commons land, who are extracting from abandoned coal mines or open cast coal mines or coal depots, railway wagons, and so on. So what does this example prove? The point that it makes is that Adam Smith's invisible hand of market operates in the informal sector by, poor people, when they are dispossessed, they do not have the strength of trade union. In 70 years of Indian independence, trade union movement has not been able to organize informal sector workers. Sorry, Oshinda, but that's true. And so they don't have the flags to hoist up high and march on the street. So they protest by taking up a share of what they think rightfully is theirs. So they are taking a share of the economy. This is the invisible man. And now I will come to the last story, the story of Kobe. You know, Kobe is in Meghalaya, in Northeast India, and he runs a coal mine. He hires Nepalese workers and local workers, absolute, total, exploitation. National Green Tribunal wants to shut it down, but they won't be able to shut it down because Kobe has the right. Our Indian constitution has created a strange legal framework around coal, which is one of the most intricate in the world. And they have also given a special right in Indian constitution to Northeast state of Meghalaya, where people can own the resources under their land and they have the right, district councils have the right. So what is the lesson that we are getting from this Kobe story? 2 points again. One is that legal framework in India is unable to deal with the complexities of reality of informal labor in India. Point number 2 is that different rules and different institutions, dominate informal sector. Informal sector is just not to be understood through the rules that exist in the mainstream. So now I have, I have so far talked about only the direct coal mining, right? Then, Shrestha, as you have pointed out, indirect coal mining sector, induced economy in coal mining regions, everywhere. Informal labor is India's reality, So what are the lessons that we are getting? Scholarly, applied and scholarly lesson that we are getting is that, in India, we call it unorganized sector. It's as though it is waiting to be organized. No, sorry, thank you. It is the tip of the iceberg. It is the large sunken section of the iceberg. What we see in India as the economy is only the tip of the iceberg. Informal sector is the big part of the iceberg. That's where communities are. So experts call it community economy. Experts call it the human economy. They call it the social economy. The exchanges that happen, the amount of transactions that take place, the active life that is there is a humongous and fantastic. And that's where life is. It's not a niche field. I totally object. It is the bigger economy. I have been studying it not because it's a niche area, because that's where people are. And lastly, what are the policy related things? In the chat box, I have given some suggestions about looking at where you can get data, but there are also, World Bank has been trying to get data, DELF project. They have a project called DELF project, and so have a look at those things, can be done. And I think what can be done is the NGOs, the role of NGOs, no one talked about it. The NGOs can play a very important role because trade unions, this is not within the remit of trade unions. And trade unions are hard, put at to understand even this, the immensity of informal labor situation and social schemes like health insurance. NGOs can act, and there are examples of NGOs. Mine labor protection campaign in Rajasthan, for example, they connect the mine labor, poor mine labor, with all these government schemes and so on. There are things that can be done. Yeah, there are facilities. Many people don't have IDs, getting them ration cards and all that. So that's where I will end. Thank you very much for letting me speak.
Thank you, Kuntla. And because you had a lot of comments on trade union, let me invite Ashim Roy for his comments. You're on mute.
Thanks, Chandrabhushan, for inviting me to this panel. And Shrestha has actually kind of forced me to participate. And I think she has done a fairly, it's like a first time I'm really seeing something very concrete about the coal sector and coal transition framework. So I really want to first appreciate that. I mean, like all the other panelists have said, there are a lot of macro pictures that we all know about. And in the last 30, 40 years of experience as a trade unionist, one has dealt with all those broader problems. But I think if you're looking from the perspective of the coal transition, then to understand the dynamics and the actual issues of the mining area, particularly coal mining area, would be very relevant. And I'm going to just focus my questions or my points related to those specific things and not go into the larger questions of an informal sector. The idea that Mr. Ramesh, who's really, the whole question of, indigenous people's rights, the tribal rights, and what has happened in the last 40 years in terms of the loss of their livelihoods. I think those are things that are very important, but I will focus my thing to 2 or 4 observations related to the coal transition. My first point is, one can go endlessly into the debate, and one can even take back, as Dr. Santosh said, that you pick up from the ILO perspective, but from a labor perspective, we have a very simple and robust method of looking at informality. Let me go to the informality, because I think there's the distinction has been brought out by Shrestha, but the idea of informality in a formal sector and informality in the informal sector is a very important distinction that we need to, because the consequences of these two are totally different in terms of policy response. Informality in the formal sector for lot in the union movement or people who are looking active through labor process, it's very clear. Do you have a stable work process? Yes. In a stable work process, if you have fragmented or what is called a fragmented non-standard employment relationship, I would call that informality. Just it. Rest of thing can all work out. But that's a very important, the objective process of a formal, stable work process, but the nature of employment contracts is fragmented, fractured, or whatever you want to give different names, then one shows that there's an informality in the formal sector or informality in the formal labor process. That's how I would make it more cogent and so. This is very important because let's take an example of insurance. In the end of the day, government giving insurance doesn't really make it an insurance for the purpose of defining the formal workers, because essentially it should be employment linked to that. It should be employer related. So that's the core point of how you want to make a distinction between the informality in the formal sector. And this is very important. I would say to Shrestha that you should go beyond washeries and things. Because in the main mining processes today, if you were to go back and look at it, there's a lot of data from the mining sector, from the coal India sector, to the extent of what is called now a new concepts coming called raising contractors. You are a leaseholder of the thing, but you give the whole of the mining to a lease to a raising contractor. They name it as a raising contractor, and raising contractor essentially then goes into fragmented forms of different processes and takes employment. So if you were to look at from a perspective of the formal processes of the mining, you would think that there is a formal process, but essentially it's already been fragmented and non-standard. So these are all very important because when you look at in terms of transition, many of them will be losing out because they will be falling through the gap of this non-standard employment, and you will not be able to get either rehabilitation or, for that matter, compensation. That if those are the issues that are coming. That's the first key point which I want to kind of address here. The second key point is, and I don't want to really repeat what Kuntala has already said. She has far more. I have learned many of these ideas about the informality in the informal sector as a distinction from her own work. And so to me, it's very important, that the informality in the formal sector is a far more wider spectrum. But I do want to make one point here. And this is a larger experience of looking at informality in various other sectors. When you try to organize them, you also realize one thing, that there is an informality embedded into illegality. You cannot have an informality unless it is embedded into some forms of illegality. So you have an impunity of law in that area, and that allows much more larger informalization and informal sector development, and one has to address that to come to that. Now, in order to just look track from that perspective into the transition, I'll just make 2 broad points here. First is that I think the formal sector and the formal sector of the formal workers in the formal sector will have the capacity to negotiate and figure out a transition for themselves. I really feel that union movements are fairly strong to be able to do that. Whether they can do it for the informal sector and the formal informal workers in the formal sector is still a question. We need a far more bigger process to it. But more important is that if you are talking about, and I would counterpose to the framework that I have been involved with, of the fair transition, which you all are involved in, how can a fair transition happen? There cannot be a fair transitioning happening in the coal sector unless you link up the coal, what you have called, Shrestha, what you have called the coal-centric economy to the larger local area economy. What are the multiplier effect of that coal sector economy to the larger local area? Unless one studies that, one will not be able to make a transition framework which can be really fair, because that's where the people will be actually working. People are not going to get no migration workers in a fair transition framework when the migration labor itself has no fairness, that you will be expecting them to get that fairness. So the question is, how do I, because this is an opportunity for when we're discussing fairness, how do we really look at the question of that transition in the context of coal economy with the local economy? And that's where I think the linkages have to be well understood. I do think that we not only just the nature of the labor employment and nature of the workers, but also the nature of the linkages with the coal economy in the longer area, because that's an important framework which will bring in. I really feel, let's take an example, and I'll end up with this last point, which is to say that, take an example of DMF. DMF is, after all, a district mineral fund meant to be actually you created a coal cess in order to talk about really how to make the transition. But the whole of the 100% of the coal cess has been gone over into what is called investment in the renewable energy sector, which is again a big formal. I am all for renewable energy sector. But the fact is that the whole coal cess has gone over precisely from making a fair transition to supplying capital inflow into the renewable sector. And this is going to happen, which means that you will land up with even if you were to create all mechanism, if there is no power structure that actually pushes a fair transition, and which I think IFORES is one of the organizations, but we need a far more bigger social alliance. And you have to incubate the social alliance, which union movement, NGO, or possibly other social organizations have to be there. Otherwise, the policy mechanism, like the poll says, will land up supporting transition, but not necessarily a fair transition. And that's an important factor that we need to take when we design both the policy framework and the institution that will actually undertake that transition. So I'll end with that. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Mr. Roy. I think you brought out number of important, even clarified some of the definitional issue of informal worker in a formal economy. And I like the idea of fractured contract in a what you called as stable work program. Nevertheless, we will look at all these issues. I'm happy that, frankly, this debate is heating up, and I would like to invite Nidhi, who has traveled extensively in these areas, and Nidhi is going to put on her journalist hat and tell a story about what she has seen, what she thinks about this entire informal coal worker, what are the challenges she has witnessed, seen. Nidhi, stories from you.
Thank you so much, CB. Thanks for inviting me to be a part of this important discussion on coal workers and economy. And I think because I'm a journalist and I work with a rural platform, and we travel a lot to rural India, from where a lot of our informal workers basically come from. And I think I will also want to expand the discussion a little bit beyond just the coal sector, because informal workers are involved in a lot of other sectors in the country. So if you just allow me, I want to just a little bit expand the discussion. And just 3 examples I want to give from the field, making some points around informal workers in the country. One is, when you talk of informal workers, which even Mr. Roy just pointed out about the issue of displacement and issue of migration. When you're talking of just transition, unless we look at the informal sector, migration might become a huge challenge in the coming years. Why I say so is because we recently did a ground report from Bundelkhand in the Lalitpur district. And as we all understand, Bundelkhand is a region which is drought prone, and the multidimensional poverty is very high in that region. There used to be a lot of stone mines in that area, about 65 of them, which were shut down due to one order of the NGT. And I don't want to say whether that was good, bad, or whatever, but it was shut down because of environmental reasons. And it is believed that almost 1.5 lakh families in the region were dependent on those stone mines for their livelihood. And again, which Shrestha was also saying, that there is no data, and how do you define informal workers? That problem also came in here because nobody really knew how many informal workers were dependent on these mines, but some rough estimates say that about 1.5 lakh families were dependent on these. These mines were shut, which meant that all these people, when we visited these villages, they were actually ghost villages, because all these people had migrated to bigger cities to work. Because when these mines were shut down, that was, I think, 2017 and 18, nobody thought about what will happen to the livelihood of these informal workers who are dependent on these mines. So they all migrated to bigger cities. And then the big thing happened of the nationwide lockdown. All these families returned to these ghost villages, and they had absolutely no work. They were almost famished. During the lockdown, we traveled to these villages, and where people actually told us, "Kya hum apne bachchon ko patthar khilaएं?" Because their whole idea is, "Aap patthar bacha rahe hain, you don't want us to fodo the patthar." But at the end of the day, I have no work at all. There is a nationwide lockdown. I'm forced to come back to my village, but there is nothing, no work, no livelihood. So I think that migration display is a bigger issue. Second thing we must also keep in mind is that, again, a lot of these informal workers who work, whether it is in coal sector or any other sector, are again migrants. So coming from somewhere villages and working in these areas. In Gujarat, South Gujarat, there are about 12 sugar mills that we studied, again, formal sector. But on those 12 sugar mills, there are around 1.5 to 2 lakh migrant tribal workers who work to cut cane for these factories. And they are all informal. They come right from Madhya Pradesh to Maharashtra to parts of Gujarat. And again, there is no wage security. For 6 months that they cut cane, they are not paid any wages. At the end of 6 months period, the whole wages are calculated. They are paid, I think, 280 rupees per ton, and 280 is paid to the pair. It's usually the husband and wife who work in the field. So, which again means that because there is no wage security in the informal workers, they are dependent on taking loans, and the loan that they take is deri ka byaz, which is like 50% interest, which means, I think one of the panelists was talking about, how they get trapped into this whole thing. So unless, when we talk of just transition, we look at these issues, it's very difficult to talk about, energy transition in the coal sector. And the last point, which again I keep talking about, is unless we look at the informal sector, when we're talking of this transition, illegalities will continue, because there was a time mica mining was happening at a large scale in Jharkhand. It was shut down due to various reasons. Nobody bothered about what will happen to all the local tribal people who were dependent on these mica mines, Dibra. So even now, that illegal mining of mica continues to happen, despite the fact that formally it is, and it's far more dangerous now to do mining over there because it's completely illegal. So I think these are three points that I wanted to make. And again, when we talk of informal workers, I think it's very important for us to also look at women in informal sector as a separate category. Because there are different challenges when it comes to women in informal sector, whether it is the wages, whether it is the health, or the other issues. So I think these are some broad 4 points that I just want to, point out. Thanks.
Thank you, Nidhi. Thank you very much. Just wanted to say, I think I'll pick up from what Ashim Roy said, and many people are talking in the chat box. The fact that, in fact, renewable energy itself is becoming a major sector of informal workers. There are very few jobs, and the jobs that are there in renewable energy right now, which is available to the local community, for example, cleaner and guard, in fact, most of them will fall under the informal category themselves. And then going back to the point that Kuntla said, that informal workers are created. They are not there just because they're there. The socio-economic condition, the disposition, uh, the political economy creates informality. So even the most modern economy in India, renewable sector, is creating informal workers. So it has nothing to do with which sector workers are working in. Uh, Let me go quickly to few questions. We have, Sresha, we have about 10 minutes, right? And
I think it's a very vibrant session. So
yeah, I think there are a lot of issues, a lot of discussion in the chat box, starting from someone commenting that it is District Magistrate Fund, not District Mineral Foundation. But let me just ask, Nagaraj has asked a question directly to you, Shrestha, essentially saying, based on your field work, roughly what proportion of female workers are there? Did you do any estimation on this? Gender.
Yeah, so generally, to say that, as I said, that if I take female workers are far less because they are excluded from certain kinds of job. So like technical work, you never see females. So largely, if we take cleaning work, there is male and female. Our estimation says it's about 50-50. As I said, that we did look into female and the thermal power when we did this coal
So
bus.
quickly, we don't have
Yeah,
time.
so female is look like cleaning, it will be 50-50. Coal gatherers and sellers, I would say coal gatherers are mostly female. So there is an that's really shifted towards female. And then there are casual labor, which I would say mixed, but their male proportions are higher. But coal gatherer and seller, coal gatherers, I would say it's 90%, I would say female. That's our observation. Yeah.
Okay. There is a question which I think any panelist can take up, which is by Mr. Sahu, and his question is, if coal mines are phased out, as Government of India has agreed to have net zero by 2070, how is it going to aggravate migration situation of the informal worker? And I think Nidhi did touch upon this point, but Kuntla, if you would like to pick up this point on and shed some light on migration and closing of coal mines.
Oh, thank you, Chandra. We seem to be, inventing a topic and then starting this fresh discussion on it. But mining has a history, and mining has some social, brings some social characteristics. Wherever mining occurs, there is a heavy migration. Mining brings out migrants from all around the area. The agriculture of that area quickly dies out or over time dies out. So what we call depeasantization. So depeasantization and decay of agriculture is, say, look at Raniganj, which is the oldest coal mining district in India. Raniganj or even Jhoria. Raniganj Jhoria is a continuous belt. Jhoria is now in Jharkhand. You would see that entire region has given rise to an urbanized tract. What we call a conurbation, continuously urbanized tract. Start from Durgapur and then continuously Durgapur to Asansol to Chittaranjan and then goes on. And now that is expanding to Dhanbad. And now it is expanding up to Hazaribagh and to Ranchi on the west. So as Hazaribagh becomes more and more a mining area. So this is a huge amount of influx of migration that had taken place. And as coal dies out, and unless we can provide, some community economy support for building up infrastructure, provision of social protection and so on, there will be out migration. And it makes you wonder why in 70 years of independence, we have not been able to reach basic social protection programs to these precariats, who dominated, and so much of bad press informal labor has received. I'm sorry, Nidhi, the illegal everybody has the right to come, quickly to Jharkhand, few days of taking shots and then go back and produce a paper about how these people are stealing valuable national assets. All bullshit. Anyway.
I don't think that was what, the issue was.
No.
I think there is a question which is about renewable. Answer has been given. Arjun was asking whether renewable will replace coal and what other alternatives are there. There's a lot of discussion on this topic, Arjun, that has happened in the chat box. You can read that. The question that Nagaraj has asked again, and the question essentially is that when people are talking about transition, what is the time frame they have in mind? Frankly, the one time frame that everyone has in mind is what Government of India has announced. Okay, that is 2070 as net zero. And then the other time frame which people like us have in mind is what IPCC report is talking about, 2050. Okay, so I think the time frame for transition is anywhere between 2050 to 2070 for phasing out of fossil fuel. That is what people have in mind. I think some people might have different thing in mind, but this is what the range is. Can I ask? There is a question on child labor, and I can see Dr. Santosh. The question essentially is that child labor is deployed for coal gathering and picking, and how should such engagement be accounted for, and what rehabilitation measures should be planned? If you want to say something, or even Mr. Ashim can address this issue. Dr. Mehrotra?
Well, the standard strategy in our country has been to ensure, I think as I was suggesting earlier, ensure that all these children are in school. They may spend a little bit of their time initially working as well as studying, but what would have been useful to learn, if I don't know whether Shrestha collected this information, in your future work you could, how many children were studying and working. Because even in these poorer states and in the rural areas where these mines are, schools are present, and there is school meals available, and all children are likely to be enrolled. In fact, net enrollment rate in India at primary level is 97%, and it remains very high even up to the age of 14. And in fact, secondary enrollment in India, including in the poorest states, is of the order of 80 to 85%, which is for 15 to 16-year-olds. That's at grades 9 and 10, because state governments are providing scholarships, particularly to girls, to remain in school if they transition from class 8 to class 9 into secondary. So, I mean, that's a standard strategy, but quite clearly, if the time frame for the transition, the just transition, is as much as it is, we are in 2022, we're looking at a time frame of something like 28 to 48 years, if we're talking about 2050 to 2070, then clearly there's prospect for the kind of transition that I was envisaging, with significant investment into construction taking place, with its own knock-on effect of drawing in private investment and a transition to an industrial economy, increasingly from a predominantly agrarian economy. And migration is part of that. There's no getting away from migration. These workers want to migrate. As I was saying, 5 million people were leaving agriculture after 2005 every year. The absolute number of workers in agriculture was falling at that rate, 5 million per annum. And the tragedy is that the opposite has happened just because of COVID.
Okay, so thank you, Dr. Mehrotra. Ashim Roy, if you want to add something on child labor issue.
No, I would not add anything on, already much has been said, but I just want to say one thing that, that one needs to really have a comparative picture. I think there's a lot of possibility of learning from rural transition. Like, to give an example, the whole idea of coal-based museums and the whole base of tourism is something that rural has really produced in a fantastic way. I've been there and I've seen how actually museum, which is like, once the coal gets transited out, the idea becomes that coal industry itself becomes an object of study. And so there's a very interesting methodology and framework that I think the rural has taught us. And I would say there are two more transitions that we need to really look at it, both the Rust Belt of US, where the metal sector, where the iron ware closed down and what happened, and the whole coal sector in at least in US, because this will give some idea about what are the mechanisms, the institutional framework for making this coal transition, how we can all gel together into this framework. And that, I think, is a very important, and I would look forward to seeing that some of these discussions go into that areas also. Yeah.
Thank you. So we are running out of time. I just have 1 or 2 minutes to summarize. Let me start by saying that in just transition, I think the discussion on specific issues, for example, informal worker, informal economy, migration, gender, these will become more and more important. Before we think about think about policies and other things, which is important. We need to start planning from now. I think Timon has just said that, even if the transition is 20, 30 years in future, if you do not plan now, you will not get that transition done. One of the advantages is that we are talking about something which is going to happen over the next 2 to 3 decades, or even 4 decades. So we have this opportunity to plan this transition. But that opportunity is an opportunity only if we start planning from now. But nevertheless, I think to think about policies in just transition, or to think about frameworks, which is important to do, I think it is also important to start looking at specific issues of informal worker, gender, migration. These are very important topics. We will continue working on these issues. We wanted to do this discussion on informal sector because it was becoming a very, very hot topic of discussion in just transition debate in the country. We wanted to come out with at least the first discussion paper to start looking at this issue, but this is not the end of our work or work of many of our colleagues in other institutions who are also looking at just transition very closely. So thank you very much. This is the first paper, but I can assure you that in near future, we will have more subject topic specific discussion that we will organize. Please do come and participate. Do write to us. We will be most happy to respond and engage. I would like to thank all my panelists. I think they provided great inputs. The discussion became a little heated, but it is important that we have a strong opinion on this issue, because we need to get this right. With this, let me thank all the participants. Your question and discussion in the chat box was very vibrant. We hope to engage and be in touch with all of you. Thank you very much. I'm ending the webinar right now. Thank you. Thank you.
The recording has stopped.